I'm pretty good at resetting how hungry I am. Before I did this, I was at a pretty high paying VC job and I could coast and do whatever I wanted. Understanding of what you want and then being able to understand how hungry you truly are for that and being able to commit. That's how I've been able to navigate things, which is being able to say, I'm willing to swallow my pride and start from the bottom and just hustle my way through because I really want this and I really want this to succeed. It wasn't really a framework. It's just like being able to be confident internally that I am definitely going to be doing this and I really want it from the depth of my heart. And that's how I'm going to do things.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Join us at the Startup Conference Echelon X. Engage with over 10,000 of Asia's innovators and decision makers on May 15 and 16 at the Singapore Expo. We have 30 exclusive complimentary tickets for our podcast listeners. Sign up and use the promo codes BravePod or ECXJeremy to claim your free tickets now. Hey, Chia. Good to see you again.
Hey, good to be here.
I think you are actually now officially the most recurring person to come back on the Brave podcast. Lots of love.
It's always good to be back. It's always good to have a chat with you.
Yeah, and I wanted to chat with you because since the last time you were kind of like well-known Southeast Asia VC writing thought leadership, and now you're an AI founder in the US, and a lot of folks are like, what's going on with Chia? Also, I think there's a lot of folks who look at you as a role model because you're like, oh, you made the double jump in terms of role, in terms of industry as well as geography. So it's a triple jump. So from that perspective, want to kind of like dig a little bit deeper into it. So it's not necessarily like a classic interview thing, but more like a chit chat session. I guess the big one is, why did you decide to become a founder instead of stick on as a VC?
Yeah, I went into tech and I went into venture with the explicit goal of trying to start something at some point. So I like to describe it as I ended up spending a little bit too much time in venture. I obviously enjoyed my time there. I think we were able to accomplish a whole bunch of really great things with great people, great founders, great colleagues, etc. But I always had this urge to build something and make something happen and really be able to fill a gap that I saw in the world. And I was honored and privileged enough to have the opportunity to do so fairly recently with a bunch of co-founders that I greatly respect. And so that's been a really interesting journey. And it's been interesting. It's certainly something that took a little bit of adjustment. I think I've always been pretty good about understanding very fast moving industries and understanding where value lay, at least I hope so. And being able to take a leap of faith and trust in myself, trust in the problem that we think is really valuable. And I think that's been paying off quite handsomely recently. And so I've been really excited by everything.
Amazing. So we're definitely talking about what you're building and what you had to learn along the way. But on the career side, there's a lot of folks who enter VC with the idea that it gives them that ladder or that staircase to becoming a founder eventually. Do you feel like that hypothesis panned out? Because right now you sound like a Manchurian candidate as a VC founder. I look like a VC, but I'm actually secretly a founder to be. So how do you feel about that?
I don't think so. I don't think my years in venture really helped me too much. I think looking back, and I probably should have, if I wanted a straighter path, I don't regret anything I did, but if I wanted a straighter path, I probably would have started something sooner. And I do think I should have started something sooner, but of course I would have probably have done something completely different back then just because of the nature of what the market was like and where it was, etc. So I don't regret anything on that side. I think only thing that venture really helps with is just trying to understand how people think about investment opportunities, how people think about what's interesting. I think that as an investor yourself, and spent a lot of time kind of investing, you also understand that difficulty of being very comfortable as an investor. It's a very well-paid job where you get to basically say no to people 99% of the time and you don't risk anything fundamentally. And so that's a great job. And it's honestly a privilege to be able to say, I don't want that and I want to do something else. I'm definitely privileged to be able to do that. And it's very easy to kind of fall into it. And it's very easy to have a very cynical mindset about what should exist, what shouldn't exist, especially when feedback loops are so long and you may not necessarily be correct, especially given everything that's happened historically zero interest rates in the venture scene. And so I think building really gets you a lot closer to understanding what's truly fundamental as opposed to what could be broken about business model.
Yeah, I think that's something that I also found valuable because I used to be a founder, right? Twice. And then after that, I joined the VC side. And I felt like what I definitely got out of it was that I think I understood how VCs think in terms of their process, why they like information asymmetry, why they delay and take their time on term sheets. So I think I really got a much better sense of the capital raising process. But definitely, I agree with you that to some extent, the skill sets of how to build were not very well used, right, in that sense. Let's double click into that a little bit, I guess. So, what are some myths or misconceptions about VC skill set that doesn't really apply to being a founder now from your perspective?
Yeah, for sure. I think that VCs are great at cataloging things. And as someone who wrote a lot, I think I'm certainly guilty of that. I think I did an okay job at being a cataloger of information. And that cataloging process is helpful. Paul Graham's YC essays is a fantastic example of timeless advice that's going to be helpful even if you're starting a company 50 years from now and things like that. I think that what I've come to understood is that it's much harder to make assessments on non-obvious opportunities. And if things are moving super quickly, it's hard to catalog it. And so you have this time lag, I think, where unless you as a you as an investor are very close to the ground and have a good understanding of how your portfolios are doing things on a very operational basis, it's very hard to keep up. It's something when I was investing, I tried to do a little bit of. I wouldn't say I was very good at it because it's hard. You're spread super thinly, and let alone trying to get into granular operational details is basically impossible across multiple companies. And so I see that gap. And I think that gap is where a lot of opportunity really arises fundamentally.
Yeah. I think I really like what you said about cataloging because I really felt that as a VC because it's almost like you have to cover every geography, every vertical, and have that landscape view of who's the best team and not, but you don't focus on anything, if that makes sense. And then your value is also synthesizing and maybe promoting that knowledge as well in some way, either to an LP or to your teammate or to your partner or to some founder who's learning for the first time. So a lot of information, traffic warden, traffic light kind of dynamic there. So I guess one thing I struggled with personally is that I think that as a VC, the inverse or converse of that traffic warden is that there's almost a requirement to be agreeable in the sense that there's a bit of consensus orientation in that sense. Versus I think as a founder, you get to be disagreeable. You get to be more opinionated about something that you do know very well. I'm just wondering, how do you feel about that?
That's a really interesting framing. I really like how you've done that. I think that's right. I think being able to understand it's such an interesting thing because I've personally written a lot about how momentum investing works in the venture space as a descriptive thesis of how it happens and things like that. And you can see kind of consensus being obviously besides a very natural social phenomenon that people tend to adhere to, also having very positive kind of financial outcomes. And it's certainly something that has good reason to exist. And you're right in the sense that actually kind of non-consensusness is helpful and valuable. Of course, you have the counter thesis, which is non-consensus could mean that you're early, non-consensus could mean that you're wrong, non-consensus could mean that you're right, but no one likes you and no one likes the fact that you're right. And so there's a kind of a whole spectrum of things there. And I think about, for example, the stories of some of the alternative like vaccine approaches, for example, that never really popularized until it became obvious that things like that were needed. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic. But I think at the end of the day, like the job is to ultimately get results as fast as possible. And it's still the job to fulfill at the end of the day. And it's an interesting dynamic. I think it's a dynamic that needs to be watched out for. But at the end of the day, the results need to be hit. And that means identifying and figuring out the best way to drag as many people along that journey with you, that still needs to happen.
What are the skills that you had to learn now that you are a founder from your perspective? What are things that you wish you had learned earlier or you had some like download earlier in terms of?
Yeah, for sure. I think you can't have too much experience in product. I love it. I think product is one of the favorite phrases is a great product is a function of strong opinions expressed. And a strong opinion can't be contradictory. A strong opinion must be forceful and well expressed and well communicated and coherent. And I love understanding how product and opinion match. To me, it's a conceptual exercise which needs to be obviously drilled down to its very tactical end conclusions. So product, sure. I think having as much experience with product really helps prepare you for building anything really.
Yeah. And what's also interesting in terms of your shift as well is that you also geography. So you moved from Southeast Asia and Singapore to the US. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. It was interesting. I mean, I'd spent a little bit of time investing in the US before this. I'd spent a little bit of time in the US, but not a significant amount of time. But I think this is maybe where VC helps you a lot. I think VC is all about entering, and entrepreneurship is obviously a magnitude of that, but VC is all about entering any room and just trying to know everyone and pretending that you're important. And being a founder is maybe less the important bit, but being in the room and being able to get great takeaways from various experiences. And that is one thing I think VC and entrepreneurship does have in common.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that to some extent, we have inverse relationships for a while in terms of journeys. So for myself, I was a US founder moving to Southeast Asia VC. Now I'm back to building. And then for yourself, you were moving from Southeast Asia VC to US founder. So a little of a Benjamin Button here. What do you think is, and we've talked about this as well. You asked me for advice. I talked to you about it. We also swapped notes on Southeast Asia VC. So you helped me out as well. What's some advice you give to people from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that parallel is hilarious. And also that we're the first and second Singaporean to plus two. So it's a bit crazy life parallel. When you mean advice, do you mean like people moving from Southeast Asia to the
Yeah.
US?
How would you compare the ecosystems at a high level?
Yeah, the US ecosystem is super dynamic. It's extremely competitive. And the way that you need to think about businesses and funding models and competition and who are the natural stakeholders in the industry is extremely different. And besides the common stereotypes about different business models in different markets and understanding local culture and things like that, which is always going to be generally true, I appreciate the opportunity to be competitive in a very different way, in a slightly bigger market, in a very dynamic space. Obviously, Southeast Asia is dynamic in its own way, but I think given the tech focused nature of venture capital markets in the US, I think it's really interesting. And I think not having slept much in the past 3 years, 4 years has been a good way to make sure I'm up to trends and being competitive accordingly.
I think a lot of folks in Southeast Asia now, they were very, very optimistic and we were very confused by the optimism several years ago. And then now people are very, very pessimistic about Southeast Asia as a tech ecosystem. And so I've met many founders and VCs who are very much either in the process of moving to the US or thinking about doing so. What do you think about that?
It's interesting. I mean, look, I'm still optimistic about Southeast Asia. It's home first and foremost for myself. And Southeast Asia suffered a little bit from a mismanagement of expectations as opposed to kind of economic reality. I think Southeast Asia is still one of the healthiest regions in the world, but we had a lot of expectations riding on it, and it intersects very neatly with the specific zero interest rate period that we had and the general euphoria that took place over the last 4 years, which is a global phenomenon, not a Southeast Asia one. And so when some of these expectations may not necessarily perform, you start to think about some of the foils against it, right? And so one of the big complaints is really monetization in Southeast Asia and the depth of the market and things like that. And so a natural reaction to maybe mismanaged expectations about that and the timelines for monetization obviously means that you try to go and think about what are great, lucrative, deep markets like the US to tackle. And so I think it's a very natural reaction to things. I think moving forward, Southeast Asia will still be an interesting market, but obviously the nature of the opportunities change, the nature of expectations do change. The fundamentals are still there. And so I think we'll see a rise. I've been on record saying many times that Southeast Asia markets parallel Indian markets. There were very similar euphorias back in the day, 10, 15 years ago in India. And no one is going to say that the Indian tech market is bad, even though I think some people will argue that the Indian tech market is suffering from a very similar euphoria right now. There will potentially be some correction that will happen there, and similar attitudes will rise and fall. But look, India now has a great booming tech market that is exporting software all across the world and is a great powerhouse. And so I think we'll see similar things at some point. It will just be a matter of managing expectations of timelines.
Yeah, I really like what you said about timelines, right? I think over a 50-year timeline, Southeast Asia has economic fundamentals to keep growing. I think there's strong dynamics. And over the next 10 years, I think the ecosystem is structurally harder than the US ecosystem, especially for VC fund outcomes. Of course, within the next 1 year, there's still a lot of tech opportunities as an employee and as a contributor versus euphoria a couple of years ago. I guess from your perspective, this debate about how much structurally harder Southeast Asia is compared to the US, right? So I think you're now starting to get a little bit of experience on both sides. Some people, including myself, I will probably peg it at least maybe say 3 times harder, I would say, as an ecosystem. I'm just putting apples to oranges here. Southeast Asia is a very wide region as well, but I guess when I say this, I'm also looking at Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam. I think some people are more bearish. I think they think maybe it's 5 to 10 times harder. I'm just kind of curious, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's hard for me to put a number. I don't think I have enough experience to really understand that. I think you're probably best placed to actually understand, especially with latest data, because I think you also building in a it was still a relatively tough time, definitely not the peak of the euphoria period. So you've really had to push it. That it is harder in the sense that the competition and the bars is way higher, right? The people you're competing with is insane in a whole bunch of different ways, and you really need to know what you're talking about, and there's no way to hide it, especially if you're like myself. I'm basically an immigrant to this country and had less resources than I would have back home. I think that's my perspective fundamentally. But I do think you're right. I do think that at the end of the day, the depth of the market really is reflective of everything. If you're very deep markets, your ability to charge, your ability to make money from disposable income is just incrementally much harder. So is it 5 to 10x? I don't know enough to say, but it's certainly hard as a general rule. And I think timelines to success is just one thing that you could be as smart as you want, you can be as hustly as you want, be well connected as you want, but if timelines are timelines and the market is the market, then it's fundamentally a question of, are you willing to wait 15, 20, 25 years to succeed in Southeast Asia? And I think that's a very tough question, because I think it's very, very hard to say that. And I think there's many famous founders like Jensen that talks about how, if I knew this is going to be that hard, like this long, I wouldn't have done this, because it's your life. It's literally your entire life for an unclear outcome. That's really hard to ask for people.
I really love what you said about outcomes and timeline here. I think that 15 to 20 years is probably the right way to think about it. Asia, especially. I think that it is a unique privilege to be in America and to be able to think in a 10-year timeline, which is because of the capital and acceleration that they have. So it can be very much, people are like, hey, I'm going to build a startup for 8 years or 10 years and be done with it and then move on to the next thing. But I agree with you. I think in Asia or other emerging markets, being comfortable that perseverance may mean that you're around for 15 to 20 years. I think it's a little bit of a higher bar for what kind of business or vertical you want to build in, honestly. When you think about all of this, obviously there's been a lot of transition. Are there any particular resources or mindset that you felt like, because you had to navigate these changes in terms of VC to founder, from Southeast Asia to US, and obviously from a generalist to more of an AI focused perspective? Any general things that you had to turn to or have a mindset around?
I'd like to say that there was a set of resources or even like a framework. It really wasn't. The biggest thing that was the most helpful for me was, I think I'm pretty good at resetting how hungry I am. And what that means is that it was easy before I did this. I was at a pretty high paying VC job and I could coast and do whatever I wanted. And again, that's just true for VC in general. And the main exercise I had to do was, how much do I want this? I think being a founder is less sexy. It's probably not sexy anymore. Am I doing this because I want to do a sexy thing? Am I doing this because I really want to solve a problem and own it and solve it end to end? And how hungry am I for that? And I think that's really it, which is understanding of what you want and then being able to understand how hungry you truly are for that and being able to commit. For me, that's how I've been able to navigate things, which is being able to say, look, I'm willing to swallow my pride and start from the bottom and just hustle my way through, because I really want this and I really want this to succeed, and that's what I'm going to spend my time doing. And so I think that's really it. There wasn't really a framework. There wasn't really anything. It was just like being able to be confident internally that I am definitely going to be doing this and I really want it from the depth of my heart, and that's how I'm going to do things.
I really love what you said about resetting your hunger. And I think you obviously shared earlier about how I think VC is very comfortable. You get to say no 98% of the time, you're being paid well, people come to you. It's a bit of a ego trip, I would say. So I guess when you think about resetting your hunger, was it unpleasant to reset your hunger, or was it pleasant? What can we go deeper into that?
I would say it's definitely not easy. I'm in a very privileged position. A lot of what I've done in my life does carry through. And so I don't get to reset from zero. I hear stories of people in America, the classic American story of they were a doctor in their home country, treated with respect, came here, became a cleaner, and worked their way up, right? I think that's the kind of attitude that I admire a lot. And I'm not that. I came to America through Harvard, right? That's not starting from zero by far. And if people can do that historically in America, I can try to at least do my best to match that. And that was my attitude. And that's what drove me. And was it painful? Obviously. I think there's a lot to it. But that's where I think it comes back down to, okay, what kind of life do you want to lead? How hungry are you really? Because, yeah, both of us, we can pretty much do other things that are way more comfortable and way more lucrative. And so that's really it. So yeah, it was definitely painful for sure. But that's, I think, something that you need to be able to calculate as part of that formula.
And I think the interesting thing is that hunger is often seen as a negative thing. Like you shouldn't be hungry. I actually got to that feedback. I was like,
Really?
and I'm just like, yeah,
Maybe hunger and hustling. I think hustling is certainly viewed in a more negative tone in other geographies. And I've certainly been in a country before, which is probably not the one that audiences will think it is. But I've been in a country where when I complimented someone and say, I think you're a hustler, they initially took that as potentially an insult. They were trying to ask me, why do you say this? And so I think that's interesting, right? And maybe I'm living life wrong. But I do want to be hungry, and I think I do want to be able to see how much of an impact I can make. And I pay costs for that. You do too. We pay a cost on our health. We pay a cost on certainly our social lives and other things like that. But I think that's what is who we are, and we're okay with that. Hopefully, on some level, hopefully on a very deep level, and as long as you have alignment there, then I think that's fine.
yeah. I think what's interesting as well is that you're making a set of decisions to build on that hunger. And how do you manage that? Because you talk about trade-offs, right? Like in terms of body and soul and so forth. But obviously there's a big push on work-life balance, which is not the right phrase, but like the integrated health system and all this other stuff. How do you think about that?
It's a tough question. I think it's part of the general kind of work-life balance and whether or not it exists, whether or not it's a myth. It goes back down to what you identify as, and are you comfortable with what you identify? And what you identify as can be completely obsessive. I think there was not necessarily be the best way to think about it, but there was also a quote growing up that really inspired me, which was don't talk about what you would live for, talk about what you would die for. And to me, I certainly have a little bit of an obsessive personality, and so therefore that philosophy does fit. But it was also a reflection that I'm glad to be somebody who can obsess. I think that's also a little bit of a privilege to be able to devote everything to a cause is not something people can sometimes have.
Yeah. I think you often use the word reset in conversation. And how do you reset personally?
Good friends. I have the privilege of having good friends. I have the privilege of my fiance. I have the privilege of many mindless activities that I do. I think that's what I personally do. But I think at the end of the day, I'm really appreciative of even the founder process because I think it also helps you understand who your friends are and who will actually be there for you when things go to shit, when you can't really devote the time that your friends deserve and who sticks around. And so I've been a lot more grateful, and I think a lot more grateful of the relationships I have in my life. And it's not something that I think I maybe have taken fully recognized before.
I think it's been about at least 5 years, no longer, since we first hung out. Where was that? In the Orchard Road, Singapore.
In
What year
person?
was that? 2016, maybe?
No, 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 no.
2017?
We met in 2017 because I was working in Sri Lanka at the time. And
Right. And you were telling me your dream to be a founder one day.
oh, really? Okay, yeah, I probably should.
Yeah, he said that. He was like, Jeremy, I want to talk to you to this coffee chat because you're a founder right now. Is Harvard a good place to do entrepreneurship? Should I go to 2+2? Should I not go? People who don't go to HBS tell me I shouldn't go to HBS and the MBA is worthless. And then I was like, why do people who don't go to something tell you not to go? It's like people who are not parents telling you to not be a parent versus you should be at least be a parent to tell people whether you regret having kids or not. Anyway, so any advice if you had a time machine going back in time, back to 2017, right? So it's like almost, wow, 7 years ago, effectively. If you had that time machine and go back, any advice you give to your younger self? If you were doing a coffee chat with your older version of yourself instead of me?
Yeah, I think there's two kinds of lives. And I think that the first kind of life is where you recognize that certain things require very deliberate planning to get to. Trivially, for example, if you want to be president, it's not necessarily be a straight path, but there are things that you have to do to get there. And this means building career, being a partner, a consulting firm, or whatever. It may not be a straight road, may not be an easy road, but there's a very straightforward road you need to dedicate yourself to. And then there's a road where you be a founder and you're basically in the business of managing chaos. I think I was trying to optimize for both at the same time. And it was because I was afraid to go all in on a very fundamental level. And I was attempting to manage risk in a way that I think couldn't be managed. And so my advice moving back would probably be take a lot more risk if you're dedicated to the path of taking risk, which I was. And I ended up straddling a little bit. I think I should have been a founder a lot earlier because I realized a lot of the things that I thought I was preparing myself and giving myself experience for fundamentally wasn't that useful at the end of the day. Again, I don't regret it. It got me to the place I am today. But if the goal was really to be in the business of managing risk, being able to control risk and figure out how to create opportunities through risk, I should have gone all
Awesome. On that note, thank you so much for sharing. And maybe I'll catch you again next year.
in. For sure. Thanks for having me,
Gotta
Trevor.
keep that top spot, buddy.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, all right. See you, man. Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.